Welcome back. Joining me tonight is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, author of a new book, 5 Days. Please welcome Wes Moore. Wes, thanks for being here. Nice to see you again.
It's great to see you again, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you because the last time we talked, I was in character and I wanted to agree with you, but I couldn't. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully, this will be a better conversation than we had the last time. Not that it wasn't fun.
I had a great time last time. I really did.
Now, I'll ask you, I'll start with a question I'm asking everybody right now. I mean, there's so much going on with the country between the coronavirus pandemic, protests in the streets, the, again, exposed raw nerve and wound of the racial division in America. How are you doing?
Thank you for the question. I'm frustrated. And I think there are people all over this country who look like me who are angry, who are grieving, who are scared, and frankly, pretty exhausted. And exhausted because there is this thought and belief that the name that we are chanting and the name that you are hearing will be the impetus. That'll be the name. That'll be the one that you see real change until the next name happens. So I think for a lot of people, there's a real level of frustration.
We're all pretty shocked by the president's indication that he wants to respond to the protests in the streets right now and what he sees as violence or overreach by the protesters with military action to deploy the U.S. military into our cities. As somebody who served in Afghanistan, an active duty military, what do you think that means, that order would mean to the men and women who serve in our military?
Yeah, I was a captain and a paratrooper in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. I've seen war, and we don't need war. We need community, and we need for everyone in this nation to do all that they can to be able to confront the real injustices and inequities that have plagued this country on the basis of race. And the problem is that when you dress for conflict, sometimes that breeds conflict. You know, of all the turmoil that we've seen in the country that has taken place over the past week, two of the most peaceful places, two of the most productive protests that we have had have actually been in Newark, New Jersey, and in Flint, Michigan. So these are two communities where the poverty is real. These are two communities where the neglect is real. But there was no rioting and no looting. And so people ask why? What did they have in common? Here's what they had in common. The police departments largely left their batons and their helmets and their shields at the police station. In fact, in Flint, the sheriff said, we're going to have a parade and not a protest. And so I share the calls for peace. But this collective effort that we're seeing happening all over is about justice. And peace will not come without justice. And justice cannot come from a tear gas canister or from the end of a baton.
What does that lead to? I guess what I'm asking, some people might say, well, why not do that? What is the downside to sending in what the president might describe as the hammer?
Yeah, I think because when something or someone thinks that the hammer is coming, it's going to escalate tension. When we continue to militarize and up the militarization of what we're talking about, we can't expect the protesters or the activists to then simply just cow down. That's not what's going to happen in this situation. And it's also a very unfair ask to the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen and the Marines that we're going to ask to do this. I mean, I remember what that was like, going into communities that I was not familiar with, going into places that I wasn't familiar with the history of the contempt, walking into places where there was this idea that simply because I was walking in, that I was walking in with a flak vest and a Kevlar and an M4, asking people to trust us, why that didn't necessarily work. And so there are real legal restrictions as to the police function that the military can perform on U.S. soil, one. But also, we are once again asking our military personnel to perform an impossible task in a way that is unfair to them and frankly is not going to accomplish what it is that we're hoping to accomplish from all that.
That is something that I hadn't considered, other than the legal ramifications of it and sort of the specter of military action in the United States, is that if my understanding is the most successful police departments are the ones that have a relationship with the community that they're serving and protecting, and soldiers being deployed to a city that they may not have any familiarity with, will actually feel like an invading force. There will not be any trust or any welcoming
at all. And frankly, there shouldn't be. I remember what that was like, going into communities and areas without that, and I could read as much about the neighborhood as I wanted to, read as much about the area as I wanted to, read all my intel reports, but I was still walking into a place that saw me as something other than there to help, someone that was other than there to take care of the pain that they were feeling. I was seen as something that was there to actually just reinforce and serve as some form of a physical kinetic function. And so when people ask, like, what is the ideal police force looks like, it looks like the community. In Baltimore City, in 2010, almost 3 in 4 officers didn't live in the city proper. Many of them didn't live in the state of Maryland. But that's a byproduct of the makeup of the departments and has direct implications on how you're going to police. And so the question that we're going to be asking these soldiers that we're asking to deploy into American neighborhoods, American cities, is when you look out there, what is it exactly that you see? And if you don't see your neighbor, if you don't see someone who is familiar to you, if you don't see Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so's son or daughter or nephew or godson, then they know that. The community knows that, the community feels that. And so the idea that the community is just going to relax once the military comes in, there is no data that backs that up.
The last time that you and I spoke was on the release of your book, The Other Wes Moore. The new book is 5 Days, which is about the Freddie Gray protests in Baltimore after he was killed at the hands of the police in 2015. What's the biggest takeaway from those protests that you learned that could be applied to this moment?
Well, one, I think there are so many similarities. I remember even just writing 5 days and going over these 8 people that we follow over this 5-day period that all took place around the funeral for Freddie Gray and the unrest and the uprising that took place around it. We are literally reliving history right now, watching how similar all of this stuff is. But I think there was a couple really big takeaways that I took from that actually I'm thinking and applying to what's happening right now. One was the thing that really helped to bring the temperature down in Baltimore, that ended a lot of the protesting, that brought things to a calm, was actually when charges were brought. When the state's attorney at the time, a brand new state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, then brought charges against the 6 officers, that actually brought everything down because I think people felt that there was going to be, wow, justice had arrived. I remember that day when she announced the charges. It was almost like a celebratory a euphoria in Baltimore because there was this idea that accountability can happen. What's interesting about this one was, charges were actually brought relatively quickly on the one officer over in Minnesota, over in Minneapolis. And it didn't. There was no dissipation when it came to the intensity of the protest. And some people say, well, what's the difference? And I think for part of it is that for protesters and activists right now, the answer is that charges aren't enough. Now, what does that mean in terms of what we can do now? Is we still have to go through our normal process. There will be trials, and I know for many of us that we're hoping that both with the trials the charges have already been announced, but also that there will be more charges that will be coming, that we can come to a conclusion that will actually mean justice. But I think that the thing that many of our elected officials can do right now, our governors, our mayors, is to say that even if it's not about this one case still has to go through the court of law. We understand that. However, justice of all forms, justice in the way that we're thinking about police reform, justice in the way we're thinking about economic justice and social justice, those are things that can happen right now. Those are things that do not need to wait for a trial. Those are things that do not need to wait for future indictments to come down. And so those are things that we practically can get done right now that can truly bring a level of calm so we can begin the process of both healing and moving forward better.
I'm curious about Baltimore because while protests by their nature disrupt, the vast majority of protesters don't want any destruction. Mm-hmm. And in Baltimore, where there was some destruction in 2015, been entirely peaceful this time, unlike many American cities. What do you think the difference is there now?
I think the biggest thing, and I have to say, I'm really proud of my city right now, because there have been protests. Protests have been going on in Baltimore, but to your point, they've been peaceful protests that have taken place in the city of Baltimore. And I think it's really because it's the activists and the protesters made it so. They've been the ones leading the charge, not just controlling the messaging, but also really going out and making sure that these are going to be effective and peaceful, and making sure that the messages don't get lost by the other things. And
As
so,
no, please go ahead.
no, so I mean, so it's when I think about what have been the big differences, and who are the voices that we continue to see, there's been such a tremendous amount of focus on not losing the message, not losing the narrative. And I think we've really seen that, and I've been incredibly proud of the way the activists and the organizers and the marchers have really taken that really seriously this time around.
As the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation in New York City, you spend your time working to reduce poverty and the effects of poverty in the city. Cities all over the United States are being affected by COVID-19 at a much more devastating scale than the more rural or suburban populations of the United States. What do you think, when this is over, this is going to mean to our cities who have been affected with so much illness and sadly death because of COVID-19? How do you think it's going to change our cities?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's important for us to understand is how COVID has hit people in the cities. While it's hit everyone in the cities, it has not hit everybody equally. And I think that's also going to help to lend and frame up about what we think about the future of our cities, because we've seen disparities in health that have been allowed to exist far too long, and have not just revealed themselves, but also been exacerbated. Black and brown communities are dying at twice the rate for COVID-19, and that's really because we allowed it. And I think about it where, even in my own case, and why this is a very personal thing even for me, my father, when I was 3 years old, from a treatable virus, because the hospital sent him home and asked my mother if he was prone to exaggerations. His clothes were a little bit too haggard. His mustache was a little bit too unkempt. There was an assumption that he didn't have insurance. And so what's happening right now, and when you're looking at the disparities in the way that COVID-19 is impacting communities, both on a health side and also on an economic side, it's staggering. Consider the fact that over 40% of people in this country couldn't afford a $400 shock, and that was prior to COVID-19. 22% of people who have lost their jobs since COVID-19 were people who were living in poverty before, i.e. these were people who were working and still living in poverty, the working poor. And so when I think about the way we have to rethink our cities and rethink the way that we live, we have to make sure that people have a firm enough support system that when these singular individual shocks happen, many of which that they are not responsible for at all, that there actually is a way to be able to support them, that we can make sure that we are not having people who are working a full day's work and still living below the poverty line, that we can make sure that we have a healthcare system that does not leave people uncovered, and particularly one that relies solely on employment, because when you have jumps in unemployment, what has also now happened, you have jumps in people who are uninsured. And so this actually creates an opportunity for us to rethink the way we are going to structure our societies, our cities, how we're thinking about transportation assets to be able to move people around in a safe way. But this moment is one that we have to capture it now and rethink about how are we going to view the next 3 and the 5 and the next 10 years for our existence.
Well, Wes, thanks so much for being here. It was great to see you again.
It's so good to see you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
You too. The book, 5 Days, is available June 23rd. Wes Moore, everybody. We'll be right back.